Aloha! This is Chapter 21.1 and Chapter 21.2. So we're going to talk about how the Industrial Revolution impacted the daily life of people in the later stages of the Industrial Revolution. So as we talked about earlier, urbanization was there from the very beginning. The changes in farming helped to rise the population, and the people who were freed up from farming were able to move into the cities and fulfill the need of workers in factories. So that was really the stages of development in this urbanization process. Well, overnight, you have these towns and cities that start to develop really quickly without much planning, and a lot of problems are caused by that. But as time progresses, they're able to work through some of those problems and come up with some pretty ingenious ways of solving those problems. So some of these problems were, it was extremely crowded. It was also quite dark. They didn't have any electric lighting yet. It was very dirty. There was no sewer system that would have to be built around or underneath the cities as they develop. And then also the type of lighting that they did have produced a lot of smoke, and also the factories produced smoke. So in general, the air was very smoky, and this would have caused respiratory problems, shorter lifespans. People's lives were pretty short and difficult at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But by the end of the Industrial Revolution, we see longer lifespans, healthier people, better infrastructure within cities. Things just tend to get better for everyone. What are some of the technologies that made all of this productivity and change possible? That's the question we should be asking. First of all, we have to address one of the big issues of the time, which was child labor. Child labor was not seen as a moral problem at this time because children had already been working very hard on the farms with their families. They were part of the workforce, but suddenly when you take them away from their families and they're working in a factory, somehow a lot more abuse starts to happen. It starts to become a moral issue. Children were desirable as workers because they were considered smaller and quicker. A lot of the jobs that they were needed for were jobs that only small people were fitted for, because a lot of these jobs were like changing the spools of thread on a spinning jenny, or repairing thread that had broken and they needed to climb into the machine basically and re-tie the threads together. Those things were difficult for adults but were a lot easier for children. The problem is that these factories were filled with dust and oftentimes lint, especially in the textile factories. It was just an unhealthy situation, and plus there's a lot of moving parts. Children were expected to work for 12 hours. That was the normal workday for everyone because that's the number of daylight hours. There was no good lighting after dark, so they tried to fit as much work time in during the daylight. Most of the accidents happened about 2 hours before the end of the work day. Children would have been working for 10 hours straight. So that was pretty challenging for anyone, much less children. Another place where children were working was in the mines, and these were also horrible places for children. Oftentimes they were told to be like a damper opener. Their job was to open a door when a sledge was coming through, and they would have to keep it closed most of the time because air drafts would direct the air through the mines, and so you wanted to keep some passages open and other passages closed in order to direct poisonous gases out and fresh air in and things like that. So children are often used like that. So you can imagine kids sitting for hours and hours listening for the sound of a sledge coming up the passageway and then opening the door completely in the dark. They're sitting in the dark. You can imagine the kind of psychological traumas that these children would have developed as they grew up, if they grew up. Another thing was that labor unions start to develop. People, of course, are unhappy with the situation, but they have little recourse, and it's only in numbers that they are able to negotiate better wages. And a lot of them are frustrated because the government was very much pro-owner, not pro-laborer. One group were the Luddites. They basically didn't like all the changes that were happening. They didn't like the fact that new technology seemed to take away the jobs that existed. And they didn't see this as technology opening up new, more productive ways of producing textiles. All they needed to do was learn a new skill and learn a new way of doing it. They didn't see that. All they saw was that new technology threatened the jobs that they were doing now. And so their system wisdom of dealing with that was to go and smash it up, destroy or burn that new technology that was causing them to lose their job. Eventually, they're going to be short-lived, but that's just an example of the faulty reasoning that you see sometimes at this time. Another issue was that Great Britain was now experiencing some competition from other countries. Somehow, the technology or the knowledge of how to build these new machines had leaked out to the United States and eventually to Germany and other places in Europe. And these areas started to develop their own factories and become industrialized as well. And this new competition started to develop in the early 1800s. France and Germany and the United States caught up really quickly with England. They inevitably started to modify and find more productive ways to produce things, and not just textiles. In fact, a lot of these new ways of developing industry were in the mining and the steel manufacturing industries. There was new technology that was created specifically for developing steel, and it was by Henry Bessemer. Actually, there were several different people who were experimenting with the production of steel. Steel is an interesting substance, highly refined iron, and generally it's very expensive to refine iron just heating it up to the extent where the iron, you can scrape off the impurities and make a more purer form of iron, which would then become steel. So an example of how expensive and labor intensive it can be is a katana, because a katana is actually an early form of steel. You have to heat it up really hot, and then you beat the impurities out of the iron, coming to the surface as it's beaten and flaking off. And then what's left is this really lighter and more durable, stronger form of metal that it would be very expensive just because of all the labor that's put into it. Well, Henry Bessemer came up with a way of superheating the iron so that the impurities came off of it more quickly, and you could do large quantities of it. And so he was able to produce steel much more quickly and efficiently and with less amount of money, to the point where they were able to use steel, especially in construction. This exponentially increased the size of structures that could be created, the speed at which they could be built, and the distances that they could span. So this is when you see the first iron bridges that are built. And so this is kind of also the first time you start to see high rises being built. Up until the 1850s, 5 stories would have been extremely high. But after this, you start to see extremely high story buildings in cities simply because steel becomes affordable. There are some more inventions that are created in the 1800s. Dynamite is invented by Alfred Noble, who didn't want to be known for inventing dynamite. He wanted to be known for giving prizes to people who had invented or come up with new ways of doing things. He started the Nobel Peace Prize. Also, electricity has been around for a long time. It's not that people didn't know about it, but it was mysterious and they didn't know how to control it or produce it. And Michael Faraday defined what it is, what is happening, and started to create batteries to store electricity and also an engine to produce electricity. And his motor, or his electric engine, was called a dynamo. And so this was invented in the late 1800s. The electric light bulb was invented by Thomas Edison. Actually, it's one of the first things that electricity was used for, was to make electric light bulbs light up. He became fabulously wealthy just from this one invention. Of course, Thomas Edison made a lot of different inventions, but he was also at heart an entrepreneur. He was trying to figure out how to make his inventions pay. He made friends with a very eccentric man who was also interested in electricity. Thomas Edison hired a man named Nikola Tesla, and he came up with a new way of generating electricity, which was even better than the dynamo. It was where you have a alternating current. But Thomas Edison stole Tesla's ideas and made them profitable. By the end of their lives, they were enemies. One other development was the development of interchangeable parts. It had been around for quite some time, probably since the 1700s, when they start manufacturing guns. Locksmiths were making guns wasn't a very expensive thing, but gunsmiths started to use interchangeable parts to help reduce the cost of making guns. That gets picked up by a man named Henry Ford. So he starts to manufacture cars using interchangeable parts, and his personal idea of that's genius, which is the assembly line. This had never been really used before. Henry Ford broke down the process of making a car into tiny little jobs, like just tightening the screw on this one thing, or just just putting in one light bulb. So he broke down the job into minute jobs, and then he hired somebody for each of those minute jobs. And instead of having the person go around to the different cars, he had the cars on a railroad track that would bring in a hanging body of a car into the dock, and then everybody would do their one job. They could manufacture a car in 91 minutes, basically an hour and a half, starting from steel and ending up with a whole car. 91 minutes. By the 1920s, cars were about $280, which was a lot of money at that time, but it was still within reach of the average middle class person. It decreased the price and more people were able to consume it. Henry Ford becomes fabulously wealthy out of all of this. And he did pay his workers a lot. He paid them more than most of the other factories around, but he also demanded a lot from them. If they could not fulfill the quota that they were expected to fulfill, they were fired because everybody wanted one of those jobs. Because steel becomes more prevalent, transcontinental railroads are made possible. If you just use iron for your railroad tracks, it will break, it will rust, it will warp with the weather. Railroads were important. They are starting to become more and more popular when the Transcontinental Railroad is starting to be produced, and then 1869 it opened up travel and it made life a lot more mobile for everyone in the country and over the world. Another exciting new invention, airplanes, air travel. Two brothers, Wilbur Wright and Orville Wright, they were actually bicycle manufacturers. I guess you could say they were bicycle repairmen, but they just had a dream and they kept working at it and they eventually succeed. There were a lot of guys out there who were experimenting with flight. There were a lot of people who were trying to prove that they had been the first to build an airplane. It had to have stayed up and be self-propelled. There were a lot of people building kind of glidery kind of things, but this was the first airplane with an actual engine that goes for more than just a drift. It is actually traveling in its own with its own impetus, not the wind. So that's really what gave them this claim to fame. And 1903 is super early for having an airplane. Airplanes are going to dramatically develop between 1903 and 1917 when the United States goes to war. Actually, 1914 is when Europe starts going to war, and Europe by that point had their own version of airplanes. So World War I is kind of the first time you see airplanes used in warfare. And of course, at first, they're not weaponized. They're using airplanes simply for reconnaissance. I cannot imagine being one of those guys who is drifting over the battlefields, trying to avoid getting shot down by the enemy and taking pictures of the enemy so that you can bring them back to your commander so that he'll know where the enemy is. That would be the job of the first early pilot. Well, they suddenly realize they're easily able to be shot down because these are basically just big flying kites. So they start arming these little planes, but the early planes were very, very hazardous. Like if you were a pilot in World War I, your chances of survival were very small. Okay, and that is just leading into the next invention, which was the radio. And this is going to take off in 1890s. Very few people actually owned a radio. By 1920, the average person could afford a radio and the radio industry starts to take off. The 1920s is also where you start to see the first mass-produced advertising. And this is where Little Orphan Annie has her radio show and loads of kids would have tuned in to follow her adventures. When the Great Depression hits, 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt uses the radio to win the election and to get the United States through the Great Depression. It's an incredible tool.